Okay, well, welcome everyone to Leeds Theosophical Society and the latest in our series of Zoom talks, which we've been doing since 2020. And this afternoon, we're delighted to welcome Darragh Mason, who's a writer, a witch, a folklorist, and an award-winning travel and documentary photographer. He hosts the award-nominated podcast Spirit Box, and he's best known perhaps for his work on the Aghori and the Djinn, spirits of the desert, and he lives in East Sussex. And his latest book is called The Dark Man. So, welcome, Darragh, and thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Um, Perhaps the best thing would be to ask you where your interest in such things as folklore and witchcraft and all the associated things, when did this begin? Was it early on in your life, or was it something that you came to a little bit later on?
And thank you for the invitation to speak and to join you on this lovely Sunday. Um, it's a really interesting question, and it's a question I often ask guests, who join me on Spirit Box. When did this all start? And I'm sure it's very similar for you all here, but it started very, very young, really. My interest in, I think, the other, in its broadest sense, pretty much started when I was about, I don't know, six or seven. Very, very young. So it's always been there for me. I think is one way of describing it. Um, it became more pronounced at different stages of my life. When I hit puberty, um, I had a very strong interest in like meditation, was doing a lot of meditation and had some kind of interesting experiences around that time, started using a pendulum, that kind of stuff. So I've always kind of been slightly um interested in kind of the air, this like spirit world and kind of like magic adjacent themes. Um it's always kind of been there to some degree. Um my photographic work gave me an avenue to get into places that I may have not have had access to. So, like for example, you mentioned my work on the Aghori. Um, Being a photographer, the camera sometimes is a great door opener for people to kind of let you in and document what they do. You know, so that's my photography had that theme throughout it. My best known work was certainly of an esoteric bend. And then in the last couple of years, things got more pronounced, and I kind of did an awful lot more work in kind of the field of uh, magic and where folklore intersect. And kind of out of that came Song of the Dark Man, that book.
Tell us a little bit about the book and what that concerns.
Sure. So we mentioned kind of my work on the jinn, so the Islamic, or sort of more appropriately kind of Arabic, like fire spirits. Um, while I was in India, in 2016, I shot a story in Delhi, about the kind of the eponymous jinn that were associated with the city. I had some interesting experiences there. And I did, when I got back to England, I compiled a kind of a lecture on the gin, and then kind of that was supplemented by my photography, which I did at Treadwell's bookshop. And then kind of had nowhere else to put this stuff, so I was like, okay, I'll put it on YouTube, record it and put it on YouTube. And I started kind of getting a lot of interest. People were kind of interested in what I had to say, and kind of some of the stuff that I'd shot. So that led to further research, and I started just noticing the themes in the gin stories. Well, these really like Irish fairies, like very, very similar. Like they have. And now that I kind of look at it almost, like a decade later, it's that's even more resolute for me. Like that, what we're looking at are essentially local variations of the same thing. You know, um, you can have your own. ideas on kind of what localization means. Is it the perceiver that's projecting? Is there kind of a relationship between the observer and the observed? Or is it something kind of more tangible with the locality? I don't know the answer to that, but there's certainly a pattern. And if we look at, say, the similarities between jinn and fairies in like the folklore, you have association with treasure, association with gold, hidden treasure, as an association with magic, particularly on the jinn side, where you can bind a jinn to do work for you. I would say, in an occult sense, that would be closer to what a ceremonial magician would be doing with, goethe and demonic spirits, that kind of thing. Um, you also have an association with sickness in animals and sickness in people. Epilepsy, for example, associated both with fairies and the jinn. You have the theme of changelings, stolen children, replaced with kind of these withered children. Very much the same thing. So that kind of led me back to Ireland and back into my research. And in particular, a book by Lady Wilde, Oscar Wilde's mother, which was a collection of Irish folklore and like healing taboos and cures and this kind of stuff. Lovely, lovely book. And in there, I noticed somewhat obliquely and then in some cases more directly this theme of the kind of the king of the fairies would intercept you on a journey. So this was intercepted journey. But the king of the fairies exhibited an awful lot of the characteristics of the folkloric devil. He was also called the Lord of the Dead. So we had this kind of intersection where you have these kind of major figures seems kind of blurred together, right? So this dark interceptor that would stop you in your journey, right? The journey would go awry, all right? And when you look at that from a magical perspective, right, you're betwixt and between. You're neither here nor there, right? You're in between spaces. This is a very liminal thing. So if you can then kind of put yourself in the position of being in, rural Ireland or rural England, in the days before electrical light or any kind of motorized vehicles, a nighttime journey is essentially walking through kind of like pitch black darkness, in some places still is. So this would have had a certain amount of potency, what was in the dark. So that provided a kind of background, a motif for this interceptor, where your journey would get interrupted by this astonishing yet terrifying figure. Now, that was a kind of demonstrable pattern. You could see it happen again and again in the folklore. Now, often it would be there would be some sort of moral question with that interception, right? There'd be a question of, what do you stand for? What has meaning for you? Now, one of the stories was around a young man called Jemmy Nolan. And Jemmy was driving his cattle to the market. And on the way to the market, he's kind of daydreaming about selling his cows. And then with the money, he's going to buy a fine suit and he's going to dance with all the ladies at the Cayley. Right. So that's his kind of his headspace. Now, on the way, he falls asleep under a tree. And when he's asleep under that tree, his dreams take him into this place where he meets this dark figure, this dark man, who seems to be a lord. He's a gentry. We often see this language applied by the peasantry when they project kind of greatness onto another being. The language they're using tends to be like based on kind of class structure. So he would be a lord.
That was one of the names for them, wasn't it, in Ireland? The
that's
gentry
exactly
amongst the little people. Yes,
that's exactly it. Yeah. So you've got like the good people, the Dini Shi, the people of the Shi, or the Dini Mah, the good people. Right. And you have exactly the same in the Arabic world, where they'll refer to as the good people or the invisible people, this kind of stuff. So the same terminology exists. Now, as you quite rightly say, it's still used, that the gentry. but in this story, Jemmy is taken into the to the Lord's manor, and he partakes in dancing with the beautiful fairy women of the locale. He does everything you're not supposed to do. He drinks the fairy wine, eats the fairy food, and dances with the fairy women. All the things that are going to be. This is going to leave you stuck in fairyland. And as he's enjoying himself, they give him a fine red velvet suit, and he's having a great old time. Right. So he's living out the fixations of his daydreams. Then the music stops, and he's presented to the court, and the Lord, who established as this dark Lord, the Lord of the Dead, asks him, "Do you have a story to tell?" Right, and Jemmy's perplexed by this. He's like, I don't know what you mean." And this is analogous to Jemmy having no depth. Right, he's got no kind of creativity in him. There's nothing to him or to his character or to his motivations other than I want to sell my cows and go for a dance. Right.
Mm.
And so his answer is not pleasing to this Dark Lord. And essentially he commands his kind of fairy henchmen, take him outside and get rid of him. So Jemmy Nolan is grabbed by these fairy men, dragged outside, and they drag him out through the briar, and there's a grave there. And try as he might, he cannot break their grip on him. And they throw him into the grave. And as he falls into the grave, he grabs a hazel wand and he snaps it off this tree. And he's able to kind of beat them away with this hazel wand. Now, hazel comes up again and again in the mythology as this magical wood that is either kind of the initiator or the breaker of magic, particularly fairy magic. So he manages to kind of get away from the fairymen, and he's brought back to the court. He makes his way back to the court, and he's asked again, "Do you have a story to tell?" And he's like, "Yes, I do." Right, and this is not just that he has, been close to death and he's terrified and he's saying anything to get out of it, but when he's cast in the grave, when his mortality when he comes face to face with his own mortality, what really matters to him comes to the fore. And actually, it's not the dancing, it's not the fine suit. So what really matters to you? And this is a continuing strand throughout these initiatory experiences that people have, not just in the folklore, but in the accounts of witches and in modern occult practitioners. This same kind of test of metal, the same question of like, what do you really stand for?
Yes, yes. I mean, there is a commonality that, isn't there, that runs through many of these particular stories. When I first started investigating nature spirits and elementals some years ago, one of the first books I read was by a man called Evans Wentz, and it's called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he looks at England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Brittany.
Mm-hmm.
And although these stories are cloaked with different details, the essential ingredients are all very common. But one of the things that interests me is that you can get the same kind of nature spirit existing in Yorkshire and existing in Lancashire, but they all have local variations to them in some way. And whether this is just regional variations within a country or around the world, there do seem to be common features of these. Is that something that you've discovered in your researches?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I centered my research for this book around Britain and Ireland, primarily Irish mythology, and then Scottish witch trial records. So I centered in that locale, and like there was kind of 5 principal areas that came up repeatedly when we talk about this type of spirit, this kind of royal spirit. Is so we mentioned the interrupted journey. There's also shape shifting, or what I call a composite appearance. So your therianthropic figure, you're half human, half beast, or multiple types. You also have sex and sexual interest in human beings. Excuse me. There's the dark name or appellation or description. That those are kind of like there's consistency in that. And I think I mentioned the interrupted journey. Um, so these things seem to come up again and again. Those themes come up again and again. So, for example, in the Scottish witch trial, in Scottish witch trials, we have a very good database of amalgamated court records for the kind of 1,600 odd people who were prosecuted and tried for witchcraft. Now, it is not universal that a dark man appears in all of these records, not at all. But it is noticeable. It's significant that you will find records in there of multiple women and sometimes men talking about how a dark figure walked into my room at night and had cloven feet, this kind of thing, and kind of offered me riches in exchange for kind of devoting myself to them, right? Um, these things happen. You hear about it again and again. They will talk about sexual encounters with these spirits, like quite in some cases quite vividly, quite luridly, sexual encounters with the dark spirit. Um, I mean, the most famous one is probably Isabel Gowdy and her coven, and there was like three parts to her trial.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
If I might just take you back to something you mentioned, which is very interesting, this idea of therianthropes, human
yeah.
beings combined with animals, because we see this in Egypt, we see it in the
Yes.
Greek mythology, and we see it very much in all the Hindu stuff where you get
Yes.
but the Ganesh, for example,
Mhm.
the head of an elephant and
Mhm.
everything. Is that something that's common around the world, or does that just happen in certain places from what you understand?
Um, Before I respond to that, though, I was just wanted to get to a point with when we talk about kind of multiple variation of what we might say the folkloric devil, right? In Mexico, there is a figure. His name translates as the Dark Rider, which and I only found this out in kind of December of this year of last year. His name translates as the Dark Rider, and he is. It looks like a mariachi musician riding a horse in a dark mariachi suit with the devil's tail and devil's horns. And essentially, that's a depiction of Lucifer, but he's called the Dark Rider. So you have almost identical terminology. The figure represents the same characteristics and the same kind of potency, mythological and occult potency. And this is on the other side of the Atlantic, and the same terminology has been used. So back to the therianthropic figures. To some degree, I think this is a global thing that a representation of an animal form is understood to represent certain qualities, certain characteristics that will resonate with people, and people will kind of understand them at kind of a very kind of primal level, right? I think that's one of the reasons these kind of symbols come up again and again.
You mean they're archetypes essentially?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I think what the difference is that when we start talking about things like the Dark Man, we're talking about a conscious archetype, and this is where it really gets into the weeds, into the good stuff, as it were. But this therianthropic figure that we relate to the Dark Man goes back to the horned god, so it goes back to, you would be very familiar with like symbols like the Herne the Hunter, Robin Goodfellow, Pan, of course, and the kind of the one of the earliest descriptions that kind of I'm aware of is in the Trois Frères cave in France that Henry Brule discovered. Kind of amateur archaeologist and anthropologist and Catholic priest found this place, and there's a depiction that's known as the sorcerer there. It's dated to 30,000 years ago, with antlers, an owl's face, like a part human body, part deer hindquarters. Now, with the Dark Man, the deer in particular stands out. So we tend to get these deer horns, not always like ram's horns, um, that we kind of associate with the devil. But the deer motif stands out particularly significantly. And this is in Irish mythology in the Fenian cycle. we see this kind of motif of fairy woman who is, um, through the dark magic of the dark man, transformed into a deer in order to trick the heroes of those cycles into taking an action. Right. And what really stunned me when I started kind of investigating this mythology is you have the exact same motif in reverse in the accounts of Isabel Gowdy. And they talk about specifically the dark man, or Black John, as they called him, having the feet of a roe, or of a ray deer. So ray being a kind of an old archaic Scotch word for a roe deer. So we have this kind of inversion, which in fairyland is representation here. Um, so it's very potent and repetitive when we get into kind of the mystique and kind of the mythology around the dark man as a universal thing. I think there is some universality to it.
Yes. There also is a universality, as you referred to earlier on, about some of these stories. I mean, Evans Wentz and others talk about, yeah, somebody walking through a dark wood at night and they're met by a fairy princess or someone, they're taken into the fairyland,
Yeah.
etc., etc. And then often there seems to be this time shift. They seem to spend maybe one day in this fairy realm. They come out, and as in the legend
Yeah.
of Rip Van Winkle, many years, sometimes
Mm.
centuries, have passed. Is this something which you see weaving its way through many of these myths and legends?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's consistent. There's always this kind of like time anomaly. Like in the story of Oshin, which I talk about in the book, and this ties into the deer motif. So Oshin's mother is Sive, who is essentially on the run from the Dark Man in the form of being referred to as the Black Magician of the Men of God, right, or the Dark Druid of the Fae, right? So of the She rather. So in the various different versions of this story, the title kind of confers this spirit to the Tuatha Dé Danann or the She, right? I mean, 19th century folklore tried to kind of merge those two things together, that the Tua and the fairies were the same thing. They're not really the same thing. Like if you read the kind of like the the historic documents or manuscripts rather, they're not historic, they're not accounts obviously, but they don't say they're the same thing. Um, it's kind of just an amalgamation that's happened through time. But he's placed in that space. Now he casts a spell on Saiva, this woman, this fairy woman who's on the run from him because he wants to marry her. The only place she's safe is in a place in Fionn McCool's fort. So she finds out she can be safe in Fionn McCool's fort. She gets herself captured in the form of a doe by him and his hounds. And then once inside the walls of his fort, that night she transforms back into her beautiful fairy form. And Fiona's immediately besotted, and they spend some happy time together before she is tricked by the dark man to coming outside of the boundaries of the fort, where she perceives it's Fionn returning from a battle, but it's the dark druid who shapeshifts into the dark druid, touches her on the head with a hazel wand, and she turns back into a deer, and she's never seen again. Now, 7 years later, Fionn, still heartbroken, is wandering Ireland. He finds this little blonde-haired boy who looks a bit like him, looks a bit like Saiva, and kind of through talking to him is able to work out this is his child, and he names him Ush Ian, which means little deer. Okay, so we have this deer theme the whole way through. So Usheen is a half fairy child, right? So we've got the kind of like there's a changeling in there. Well, there's a dualistic metaphor in there, rather. Okay, so he's half fairy, half human. Now, through his story, he becomes the greatest poet of the Fianna, and eventually they're out hunting deer again. They seem to kind of constantly be out hunting deer in these stories, but He leaves the Fianna, his father, just as he entered the world, entered the human world. A beautiful fairy woman called Neve Kenor, Neve of the Head of Gold, rides across the sea and basically says to Oisin, "I've come to take you as my husband. Will you come with me?" And he does. And he returns to fairyland with her. Now, even though he's half fairy, he spends 3 joyous years there, but he wants to return to Ireland to see his companions and his father. And she gives him her magic steed to do so, but with the strict taboo of not to touch the ground. Now, when he returns to Ireland, he doesn't recognize the place. It's all different. The men are much smaller than they used to be. The great palaces of the noble heroes have declined, and he can't find the Fianna anywhere. Now, there's multiple versions of the story, but he essentially helps some farmers who are trying to move a stone, or there's like a the stone blocking the road, whatever it is, the variations. But he leans down and he tosses the stone aside because he's his immense strength as his hero. And as he does so, the belt of his saddle snaps and he falls and he touches the ground. When he does, he ages centuries instantaneously. So it's 3 years, but then they say it's 300 years. But the age of the heroes and the age of Christianity, there's kind of, it's a very kind of loose interpretation of time. It could be 3,000 years or 300 years. They don't really nail that down.
Can I ask you about the influence of Christianity? I mean, one of the things that I've come across is when you're dealing with for example, the Irish
Mm,
mythology, the Tuatha De Danann,
mm,
it seems to me that these spirits were basically turned by Christianity from being spirits of one
mm.
sort or another into Christianized myths and everything. Is that something that you would go along with?
I think this to a certain degree, yeah. Like, I mean, Irish mythology is weird in the sense that, like, one, it's relatively complete. You know, we've got a reasonably good version of what was around 1,000 years ago, right? So the Fianna, like the Fianna stories as a whole, I mean, they're from they're from a compendium called An na Shanaraka, all right, so the colloquia of old men, and it's made up of three manuscripts, two from the 15th century, the Book of Lishmore and Laud 610, and then a third from Killiney, dating from the 17th century. But the linguistic evidence in the texts date them to the 12th century. So, and these manuscripts, they reflect a far older tradition of storytelling. But what's quite interesting in this, in the whole, because these are all transcribed by monks, all these stories were written down by monks, right? Um, Apart from Latin, Ireland's the oldest vernacular literary language in Western Europe. And uh, despite the presence of pagan culture and beliefs, you know, the fairies, these warrior gods, demigods, all this stuff, the Irish medieval monks felt compelled to tell the stories. And in some areas, like there's sometimes you get these marginalia, like where they kind of reference in the scriptorium, some bored monk kind of wrote a note in the margins of some of these manuscripts. You know, and there's one lovely account where it's someone's transcribing the story of Troy, and on the death of Hector, the monk leaves a little inscription in the margin going like, I'm most upset by the death of this noble man. So these guys were engaged with the stories. You know, they were certainly kind of living them as they were transcribing them. I mean, there's other accounts where monks have left notes saying this is it's like, I finished this work and 1,000 curses on it. So, you know, some of them weren't having a great time in the scriptorium either, but they were certainly reading what they were writing, right?
Mm.
Yeah. Now the story of
Okay.
Oisin is let me finish because the story of Oisin is quite key because it does bridge the gap with Christianity quite significantly.
Mm.
Because part of the story, when Oisin becomes this old man, he's brought before St. Patrick in the stories, right? And they have a chapters called the Arguments, where they have these philosophical debates of kind of like the Fianna versus the Christian gods. And Oisin is actually does very well here, you know, and kind of calls out St. Patrick several times for saying, well, why would my heroes be in hell because they're not Christian? That's a problem. That's valid. There's a failure in that. So we have this actual debate and arguments that happen, but these are all coming from the Christian medieval mind. So it's indicating there's a dual practice there, that they could hold both these collections of beliefs simultaneously, um, which kind of, it tells you that what they were doing in their day to day probably had a lot of paganism in it. If they were comfortable with that argument.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it, how the Celtic culture, the Irish culture, others have somehow been embedded in a popular kind of consciousness despite the prevailing religion and
Oh yeah.
despite Christianity.
Mhm.
Can I take you back to something that interests me, and that is Evans Wentz and other writers have often described obviously, before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the countryside, and then the factories started and people migrated to the cities. When he was talking to people, he was interviewing people perhaps in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they would talk
Yep.
about their grandparents still being in touch with these spirits, perhaps in the year 1800. But curiously, he and others have described how when these grandparents saw these entities, they were dressed in the costumes of a much earlier era. So in 1800, they might have been, for example, dressed in Tudor costume. This
Yes.
is something that really intrigues me, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you've picked up on a detail that is absolutely fascinating, and I totally get why you find this interesting, and it's consistent, right? Like I have spoken to people who have seen the banshee and described the banshee as like, well, what was the attire? The attire would be from like the early 1800s. There's always a gap of like 2 centuries, 2 or 3 centuries where the clothing seems to be out. Now, there's one reflection on it and then one kind of interesting bit of context as well. If we look at kind of like the kind of American ufology, you have the idea of the men in black, right? So the men in black would visit somebody who's seen something and kind of essentially silence them, right? Tell them, don't speak about this, etc., etc. Now they exhibit a similar quality. So you've got accounts in the 1970s where some 1950s Cadillac would turn up and these two men in black would get out and they'd look like G-men from like a 1950s, cop show and go up and kind of make this intervention with people. So we have a similar thing in the alien lore, right? Like it's just this gap of time. Now what I think it is if you're dealing with something that has um, a far more longevity than we do. So the Jinn, for example, are said to live to like 900 years, that kind of thing. Um, who knows what it is with fairies? But if there's some sort of consciousness that is outside of the human world and they're observing the human world with more longevity, then 2 centuries worth of fashion makes no sense to them. It would be like, what's the difference? And I think that might be what it is. That it is. It's just that case of kind of like the subtlety of human fashion, like that we're kind of aware of. They're not. Now there's a certain amount of projection with that because I'd look at some teenager and wouldn't know the kind of subtlety of kind of what was you know the most cutting edge cool thing to wear and what wasn't. I wouldn't know that. You know, I might know something that would be kind of broadly in that sense, but that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like a kind of a protracted version of that. You know, that's my thinking on it.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned there, of course, Men in Black, and there are many programs these days about UFOs, abductions, and all that sort of thing. Is this a modern interpretation, do you think, of something that's much older? Because in many of these fairy
Mhm.
tales and everything, people are abducted and taken into
Yeah.
otherworldly realms of some sort. Is this the collective human psyche somehow reprising these things, or is it something else entirely, do you think?
Um, it is a consistent thing. We have the whole thing of like when people are abducted by the fairies. They go into the underworld, of some description. You know, people's accounts of what are, they being inside UFOs that look small on the outside and they're big on the inside. There's all this kind of like dysmorphia of space. That seems to be a consistent thing. Equally throughout time, we mentioned the sexual interest in human beings and human sexuality. You have obviously alien encounters that have exhibited that quality. There's a particular fairy called a Lana She, which basically means fairy lover. That's a consistent thing. The same thing with Jinn. Jinn being exceptionally jealous of of the what they deem as their human partner. This kind of stuff. So we have that kind of tension happening throughout. There are consistencies through it. Jacques Vallée, kind of his work is certainly saying, we're looking at the same phenomena with just switching masks throughout time, and there's a certain amount of sensibility to that. Pre the flight 1950s and the meme of the flying saucer entering the kind of collective consciousness. We had kind of like airships, these weird alien airships that would fly around, and these men who would come down these rope ladders and kind of talk to the locals. They always this slightly described as having this like or kind of somewhere between being Greek or Oriental in appearance. So we've had kind of this out of sync technology aligned with these kind of high strangeness encounters for a very long time. So it is certainly a possibility.
And certainly we get these things in the Bible, don't we, with Ezekiel and
Yes.
Elijah taken up to heaven, being taught about things and forewarned about future disasters
Yeah.
and so on. If we can perhaps step into the contemporary world,
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, that there has been a renewed interest in elementals, nature spirits, and also angels too.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that this is something which is, in a sense, a kind of rebellion against the modern materialistic interpretation of things. I don't know whether you would go along with that. Certainly in popular conversation, if you were starting to say to people, these nature spirits are real and they are very much an integral part of our world, many people would laugh at you. But at the same time, I think in a deep-seated part of people's unconscious, is a remembrance of these things. Would you see it that way?
Um, I think in part for sure. Certainly I do. To for a very direct answer, yes, I do see it that way. But I think the kind of the longer answer is, in my view of things, we're at the shift of an age, and we're seeing the kind of the breaking down of certain ways of seeing the world, both from our perception, but in a very real sense. In my opinion, I think we're at the changing of an age where actually the subtle energies that we're exposed to as human beings are shifting. We're going from a denser world into something that we can access more of the kind of the worlds around us.
Mm.
Um, Now, there's a number of different kind of like views and theories around that. Like, from you got kind of like new agey kind of age of Aquarius stuff. You've got like some of the kind of Thelemic ideas of like the Aeon of Horus, and kind of things like Mayan calendars. But we seem to be at a convergence point of all our kind of anchor points, of like what the world is. What can I say? That is a solid thing. I can bank on that. All those anchors seem to be being severed. Like the social contract with governments, the social contract with education, like all of these things are under strain, all of them.
Mm.
And I think this is just it's a changing of the guard, and we're at that time where there's going to be a lot of change. Some of that will be messy, and some of it less so. Um, but that's that's just my thoughts on it. I could be
Right.
completely wrong, on that. Like, but observing the world, we can see we're in a real time of flux, real time of change.
Yes, yes. The Theosophical Society has had certain members who've been particularly interested in nature spirits, notably Geoffrey Hodgson, Edward Gardner, Dora Van Gelder, and others as well. And they seem to have come to the conclusion that certainly these elementals or nature spirits, I mean, they're not physical, they exist on the astral plane, but they
Yes.
may appear also on the etheric levels, which are at the higher part of the physical plane. Therefore, it's very, very difficult to view these unless you have a particular
Mhm.
sort of perception. Have you ever seen these? Have you ever actually managed to be able to photograph any of them or capture any imagery at all of these?
Uh, not photographically, no, no. I've certainly seen things, but I've also heard them. Like I think that's what how I experience the other has often be through kind of I can um hear things like hear in the garden particularly I'll hear like my name being called, that kind of thing, or
Mm.
but when I had hair, my hair being touched, that kind of stuff. I can sense it, you know. And it's very subtle, and and it varies so much for people as well how they experience this. Some of it is very somatic. It's physical. They can sense something in their body that there's something different there around them. Um, and I mean, the thing is that like if people want to engage with these types of spirits, there's magical technology to allow you to do that. Which is readily available in the appropriate bookshops, the appropriate books. Like this is this is an ancient human endeavor. You go back to the earliest societal structures, and there will be someone whose role that was to do that mediation between us and the other.
Mm.
You know.
Mm. And we've become so divorced from the natural world in many ways, and therefore, to an
Yeah.
extent or a large extent, divorced from ourselves. And therefore, it strikes me that our perception has become more and more narrowed into
Yeah.
certain acceptable channels, and people are not really. A lot of people are not really prepared to go beyond that, but there are certain sensitive people. And I have a certain sensitivity, and like you, I've sensed these things. I've never actually seen them as such, but I've felt their presence. And the
Mm,
way that I've perceived them more than any other is through some direct sense of intuition, this
mm,
intuitional feeling that they
mm,
are there. But also, the way that I've perceived them is by sometimes hearing music or a kind
mm,
of song. That's another way that they seem to communicate.
mm,
And I find this, very, very interesting because these spirits are only perceived in terms of the kind of perception that we have in any modern age, aren't they?
mm,
So perhaps in this modern age, they might be perceived in terms of space travel or UFOs or in,
mm.
in the modern idiom in some way. Do you think more and more people will come to accept these again? Or do you think they will always just be written off now as myth, legend, fairy tale, superstition?
Um, so firstly, around the music element that you experience. So fairies are associated specifically with pipers, and kind of a musical excellence. So it used to be kind of like a kind of a marketing scam that a piper would kind of create stories around himself to try and get more business. That he'd been abducted by fairies and then had the fairies' talent, with playing, so they were directly associated with music and fairies. So it's not a surprise that you would experience that kind of thing, in a kind of nature spirit context. Equally, the jinn associated with inspiring poetry. So there's a big connection with inspiration and kind of bringing creativity into the world with these class of entities. Um, but to the kind of meat and bone of your question about people's perception, I don't think they're going to have a choice. I think as we progress through the changing of the prism that we observe the world through is changing to allow us to experience the subtle more. That's my belief. Now, again, I said caveat, I could be totally wrong in that, and you know, be off piste with it. But it's my experience over the last 4 or 5 years that more and more people are becoming interested in this kind of stuff. We had this kind of blossom of like podcast content and that kind of stuff, people talking about the experiences they have. Joe Hickey Hall is a tremendous podcast called the Modern Fairy Encounters podcast. And shows like that where people from all over the world are talking about the experiences they've had from all walks of life, you
Mm.
know. So that's there. And then groups and communities are clustering around that are sharing their experiences. And, people are finding the others, to quote Terence McKenna, on these areas and about these areas. So they're not alone and therefore kind of thinking, am I just nuts? Am I just like, do I need to talk to somebody about getting medical aid? Like the context is shifting. I get people message me all the time about, I saw the Dark Man when I was a child, and then it happened. Then they give me the context of what's happened to them. And yes, I recognize that. You're not alone in this experience at all.
Mm.
You know.
When I've done talks on this, I get more feedback from people from these talks than on any other subject. Someone will email and say, "Oh, my Finnish grandmother, who lived in a small cottage in the forest and everything,
Mm.
we commune with these all the time." Or somebody
Yeah.
writing from France to say that not now, but certainly their ancestors
Yeah.
had perceived these things. Can I just wind up the interview by asking you just to talk a little bit about your book and where
Mhm.
it's available, and whether you have any other offerings in the pipeline before too long?
No, of course. So my book is called Song of the Dark Man, Father of Which is Lord of the Crossroads, and essentially it's a book in two parts. The first part is I map out the folkloric and historical context of the Dark Man. So looking at it through kind of like a cultural lens, and then kind of tying it off with trying to explain the kind of the function, from an observable pattern, but recognizing that there seems to be no true face. There's no true name, no true face. It's and certainly that's reflected in some of the occult views of this type of spirit. The second half is made up of interviews with people who have had experiences in the modern day. So some of those are people whose lives have been randomly interjected with. Um, like when we spoke about that, the journey being interrupted, very much in that vein. Um, and then those who have taken a kind of a total kind of an immersion into the world of witchcraft, as that this experience can often um, pull out of people and kind of um, initiate them into witchcraft. So it's kind of historical context, cultural context, folkloric context, and then this is what people have experienced in the modern day. Um, and it's available at all good bookstores. I always feel a bit cliche saying that. But yeah, Amazon, all the usual suspects.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Darragh. Now, I'm sure that I wish you a very, very good week, and thank you for participating. And thanks once again, Darragh. It's been marvelous to talk to you, and I hope we might be able to speak to you again in the future.
Thank you.
So, from Leeds Theosophical Society, a very good afternoon from me. Bye bye now.